Hi everybody, Steven here. If you ever wondered what the best practices are for deploying an Edge Node VM, and you're not sure about this thing called name teaming, what's going on there? Well, stick around, that's what I'm going to talk about. See you in a bit. Hi everybody, thanks for sticking around. Happy New Year or belated New Year. This is my first recording for 2025. So what we're going to do in this video is, this could be a really long video, but I had to really kind of shorten it down. There's various ways to deploy your edge nodes, whether it's a bare metal edge or a VM edge. This video is going to be more focused on the VM side of things, but there will be some stuff for those of you that are deploying bare metal edges. Now, what I'm going to focus on is VMware's recommended practice or recommended deployment. Now, I notice I said best practices in the video, again, kind of a clickbait thing, but again, VMware is kind of now calling stuff recommended guidelines or recommended practices. Okay, so we'll take a look at the solution on how to do that. Okay, now before we jump into this, I've got a little bit of a slideshow I want to show you on a couple of things. I'll try and keep that as brief as possible. Then we have a demo where I'm actually going to go through and build this and show you step by step how to do this thing called name teaming, okay, which is part of their best practices. Okay, but anyways, before we get started, hey, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please support the channel by subscribing to it. It's really easy. You just click that subscribe button. It's totally free. Without subscribers, there's no content developers. Okay, folks? Also, another way to support the channel, I do have super thanks enabled. Totally up to you. But why don't we get started? Thanks. All right, everybody. So let's jump into it. Let's do the presentation portion. I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. Now, before I start getting into this, you need to understand routing in NSX, okay? You need to understand what the edge is and all that. I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole in this. I'll do a real quick overview on it, but I have videos on both of those subjects. I'll leave links to those at the end of the video. You'll be able to click on those. But anyways, when we talk about routing in NSX, you got a couple of options. One's a single tier, another one's two-tier routing. For the most part, it doesn't really matter what I'm going to be talking about here, because we're really going to be focusing on this portion here, on how our tier 0 gets to the outside world. Again, I'm not talking about services or anything like that. How do we peer with the outside world? That's what this is all about. So one of the things that we know is our gateways have these components. There's a distributed router component and an SR component, the service router. The distributed router component is found everywhere. So it's on your ESXi transport nodes that's been configured for NSX. If you've got any bare metal nodes configured for NSX, it's there. If you've got edge, you probably got edge appliances, edge servers, it's there as well, or edge nodes. So the DR components are on all the NSX transport nodes, okay? And we use that for our first hop routing for our VMs and stuff. Then we have the service router. The service router exists on the edge nodes only, okay? And when I talk about a tier 0 gateway, when I want to connect to the outside world, I go through a tier 0 gateway. When I give that tier 0 gateway an uplink, I say, oh yeah, here's an uplink to get to the outside world. It needs an SR component. And it says, and this SR component has to run on an edge node. And how many of those uplinks is going to be based on how you configure things, which I'll kind of briefly show you. What I want to show you here in this picture is the edge node has a connection to both the VLAN back traffic, which is in the real world, and our overlay, NSX overlay traffic, which is in our virtual world, okay? So the edge is basically the boundary between those, okay? Or the on-ramp, or however you want to call it. And that's what I'm trying to show you here. So in this example, if I've got like a web app and database segment, if the web VM is going to talk to app, it goes through the DR component. It has nothing to do with the edge here, okay? So if I go to this diagram, I've got 3 ESXi servers here that have been prepared for NSX. They have their taps on there. I'm just showing you a single tap. Now, if I got my web over here wants to talk to app, it basically comes through, hits its DR component, okay? This is a single tier routing, by the way. It basically goes back to this diagram, okay? So it hits the DR component. You see the DR component is everywhere. It's one gateway, okay? So it hits the DR component and it says, oh, you want to get onto the app segment, which is this. Let me change my colors. It is this blue segment right there. says, oh yeah, I got a connection to there, and you want to go to app VM, it would basically go over here. Well, hang on a sec, it doesn't do that because this blue line here, or these lines stretching across these nodes, is just a logical representation of an overlay network. So what will happen is, let me change my colors again. It would leave web, hit its DR component, leave its hit web, leave its DR component. The DR component would do a route decision, and at that point, it's on the app tier. But we need to get from this host here in the middle over to host 1 where the app here is. So at that point, it's going to hit the TEP here. And then at this point here, the TEP will encapsulate it, fire it across. The TEP over here on the destination would decapsulate it and then send it up. It's on the blue tier network. To the, actually, I should have drawn it from there. It goes straight to the app at that point. This DR has nothing to do with it, okay? So, okay, great. Now, how about if we're going to get to the outside world? If I go back to my picture, when I want to get to the outside world here, sorry. Let's try this again, folks. When I want to get to the outside world, let's say web here wants to get to the outside, it goes out to its DR component. The DR component says, oh, it does a route decision, says, oh, I need to get out to this whatever network you're going to. And it says, oh, I get a default route going to this SR component that's on the edge. So it's going to leave the DR component. Right now, it's still on your ESXi host. It needs to leave that host now to get to the SR, which is on an edge. So it's still in an overlay network. And this link that's between these two DRs and SRs is called the inter-tier transit link, or the backplane, okay? And this is automatically created for you when you set up your routing. Anyways, enough of that. That's all review stuff. So at this point, when the edge gets it, it will decapsulate that. This is still overlay network here. It will decapsulate it, send it to the SR, and then the SR sends it out to the physical world. And this physical world is backed by a VLAN. So you see this edge, again, is sitting between the VLAN and the overlay. So back to my picture here, and let's say web here wants to get out to the physical world. It's basically going to hit its DR component. The DR component says, oh, I need to get it to the SR. There's that inter-tier link that I talked about. And I'm showing you that in this little black line here. And this is just a logical representation. It doesn't do this. It doesn't go across like that. It doesn't work like that. It says, oh, I need to get over to that other area. So it goes web to DR. Then it hits the TEP, gets encapsulated. I'll use a different color. Hits the edge's TEP. The edge TEP decapsulates it and then sends it over. It's at this point, it's at the SR. Then the SR will route it out to the outside world. Notice again, this is VLAN. So this is kind of the important part right here. You see your edge node, whether it's physical or virtual, has a connection to an overlay network and a VLAN network, okay? So how do we set all that stuff up is basically what we're talking about, okay? Yeah, so what you're probably going to do, now there's a couple ways depending on how you got stuff set up in your physical environment. You may have your top of rack switches, top of rack left and right, just on one subnet here, and you got one interface, one VLAN. You could do something like that. Probably not the greatest, because potentially single point of failure, if something happens to that layer 2 network, this layer 2 network, if there's a big broadcast storm, everything goes down. And this is what it would look like kind of physically. So this SR, remember, this SR lives on an edge node. The edge nodes belong to an edge cluster, and you can have up to 10 edge nodes in a cluster. Now, the tier 1 gateway, I can say, oh, I'm going to spread this single SR across up to 8 edge nodes if I wanted to with a single link. All right, so what this would look like, in my example here, this picture, I've got 2 edge nodes in my edge cluster. Let's say that's my edge cluster there. So in this example, I would have one interface per edge node connecting to that network to get to my top of rack switches. You could do something like that. Probably not the greatest design. The other option, which is recommended by VMware, is, again, you have 2 separate VLANs. So you're going to peer with your top of rack left and top of rack right. And you're going to have 2 different VLANs here. So you have 2 different peering going on. Let's say they're BGP or whatever the case may be. So in this case, you see I have 2 interfaces there. So this SR is going to be spread across edge nodes. It's the same kind of thing. If I just show you 2 edge nodes, I would have 2 interfaces for each edge node. One on VLAN 100, one on VLAN 110 for each edge node. If I had 8 edge nodes here, right? Actually, sorry. Williams split up to 8-way equal cost multipathing. So if I had 4 edge nodes here, I'd have 8 paths to get to the outside world. Okay. So anyways, hopefully you kind of get that. Now, where is all this stuff coming from? Let's go into here. Let me, this is the reference design guide. Let me just get this over here. This is the reference design guide. One of the things I'm going to mention here, I know I may get some people debating with me on the YouTube channel. You want to read this guide, okay? I'll leave a link for this in the video description where you can get this. Here they talk about, again, this is page, what page is this? Page 322, all right? Here is the design guide. Let me just, hey, how come that's all messed up? Anyways, let's go to here. Let's try this out instead. So this is the reference design guide. It's 4.2. All right. This is 4.2.1. So it's fairly new here. And there's a whole whack load of stuff here. I'm not going to read through this whole design guide. What I do want to point out to you is on page 322, kind of where I'm getting some of this information. We teach a lot of this stuff in our design class as well. If I go to here, I can't go through everything, but it talks about here, the goal of layer 3 north-south connectivity is designed to be simple, deterministic, and redundant without incurring any dependencies on spanning tree configurations, right? This means that peering VLAN is configured to a specific top-of-rack switch, do not span across top-of-rack switches. Going back to that little picture I just showed you. Policy also allows for direct mapping of edge nodes uplinks to physical NICs and devices, whether it's bare metal or VM, and eventually to top-of-rack, creating this one-to-one mapping. You folks can read all that. You'll see basically this is kind of what they're referring to here. Here's that tier 0 gateway with the SR, the 2 edge nodes, and you'll see you've got one subnet for top-of-rack left, and you got another subnet for top-of-rack right. That's kind of what this is all about, okay? So this is kind of what their recommendation is, all right? Totally up to you if you don't want to do it, all right? Anyways, let's go back to my iPad only here, okay? So a couple of ways we could achieve this. With a bare metal edge, I'm not going to go down the road with bare metal edge. You got a lot of flexibility with bare metal edge as far as I'm concerned. Here in the design guide, they talk about a 6 NIC bare metal edge. So I could have 2 NICs for management. So this is my Linux stack. So I would install the edge software onto this bare metal box, and I'll use 2 NICs for my management, and I have redundancy. I'll have 2 NICs. Notice I'll create a single NSX virtual distributed switch here, and I'll use 2 links for overlay traffic. That's what the purple is. And I'll use 2 links for VLAN traffic. I kind of like that design because physically I could wrap my mind around it. These NICs are for VLAN, these NICs are for overlay, these NICs are for management traffic, right? So that's kind of nice. I really kind of like that design. So from a bare metal perspective, I really like this. And this uses this thing called name teaming, which is this video is all about, and I'll show you how to do that. There's also a 2 NIC and 4 NIC design. Here's a 4 NIC design. They're saying, hey, I'm going to use 2 NICs dedicated for management, and 2 other NICs will be for NSX stuff, overlay and VLAN. Or maybe you only got a 2 NIC bare metal. It's going to do everything, management, VLAN, and NSX overlay, right? You have flexibility here. I'm not going to go through these. Bottom line here is these are going to be using these things called name teaming. Now, let's talk about a VM. So VM's a little different. So first of all, I want to, again, I've talked about deploying the edge node VMs. What I do want to point out here is the VM itself, which I'm showing you a picture, contains 5 virtual NICs. So it's a VM with 5 NICs. You'll see over here, NIC 0 all the way up to NIC 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's 5, right? You'll see the first NIC is always management. When you create, and you'll see this in my demo, when you create your edge node, one of the first things is say, hey, what are you going to connect this NIC to? The management network, right? This NIC here has to be on a port group that's management and basically has to be able to connect to your NSX manager. Okay, so whatever VLAN that's on, it has to be able to be, whether it's on the same VLAN or routed to the NSX manager, it's got to be able to get there, okay? Or else it'll fail the install. The remaining NICs now, the 4 NICs here, are referred to as these fast path, FP ETH0, ETH1, 2, and 3. And they're using what's called the data plane development kit. Basically, they're part of this Intel library of drivers for high performance. I'll just leave it quick and simple as that. Now, this wasn't always the case. It says 4 NICs only prior to 3.2.1. So prior to 3.2.1, we only had this. We only had one for management, and then we had NICs 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so that kind of limited us on what we could do. I could say, well, I'll use this NIC here, one for overlay, and these other two for VLAN traffic. Or maybe I'll do these two NICs for overlay and just that one for VLAN. Remember, that NIC didn't exist. So it really restricted us on what we could do. VMware did come up with a solution to that, saying, you know what, we'll do this particular design, which you'll see very shortly, okay? In 3.2.1, they came out with this extra NIC, which I thought was great. Great, I'll use these two for VLAN, these two for overlay for Geneve, and that's my management. I love it, right? But actually, surprisingly, in the reference design guide, they don't make reference to that, okay? Which is still kind of a little bizarre. This is just an example here, by the way. This is not a design picture. This is just an example. That's all it is, okay? I'm going to show you the design stuff shortly. So as we're going through this design stuff, I'm pulling it from the design guide, right? Personally, me, again, if there's anybody from VMware watching this, I'd love to be able to use this for VLAN back traffic and this for overlay back traffic on a VM. Now, I'm sure I can do it, but I'm just curious why it's not in the reference design guide, right? But anyways, let's go along with what they're recommending, okay, folks? So here in this example, here's my ESXi host, okay? So there's my ESXi host. This host has not, I repeat, not been prepared for NSX. That means there's no TAP on this, okay? So maybe you're installing the host on a Edge cluster that's not prepared for NSX, which is fine. Okay, remember the Edge VM must run on an ESXi host. So there's no TAPs on this host here. Okay, so in other words, no VMs are running on this host, let's say. That's one way to look at it. So here's my Edge VM. You see the first NIC is management. It's connected to a port group called VLAN 10, management. So there's my distributed switch I'm using. Technically, it could also be a standard switch, but realistically, you're probably going to use a distributed switch. So you're going to create a port group for management. You're going to connect this NIC to it, okay? And whatever the VLAN is. Then you're going to create two other port groups. In my example, I just called them port group trunk 1, port group trunk 2. I just try to keep along the lines of what the reference design guide has. But call it something that makes sense, maybe top of rack left, top of rack right, or whatever the case may be. This is going to be a trunk. Notice we're going to connect our first FP ETH0 to that first port group, and then our second fast path interface, we're going to connect it to this one. Notice we're not using the other two. So you'll see that in the reference design guide, unless we get into bridging, which is not the topic of this video. So you see in the reference design guide, they don't really have you using those NICs. So this is considered, I don't like saying it, best practice. So you're going to say, all right, I'm going to create one NSX virtual distributed switch. I'm going to demo this. This NSX virtual distributed switch will be part of the overlay and VLAN back transport zone. Once I do that, and I've got multiple uplinks, I'm going to get multiple taps. So this edge node is going to get 2 tap IPs. Why would I want that? Well, I'm going to say load distribution. On an edge node, if you've got multiple taps, which is considered, again, I'll say it, best practice or leading practice or recommended, however you want to say it. If you got multiple taps, what will happen is each segment will be pinned to a particular tap. So if I only had one tap, that means all my overlay traffic goes through a single tap, a single NIC at that point. If I've got 2 here in this example, I've got overlay traffic going through 2 virtual NICs. Again, and this is mapped again to some physical NICs as well. So that sounds pretty good. So overlay is using 2 physical NICs. All right. How it works with the edges, it basically will say, hey, this segment will use this tap. That segment will use that tap. So web tier segment, you're using the first tap on the edge. Database tier segment, you're using the second tap on the edge. App tier, you'll go back to maybe using the first, whatever, that type of thing. Okay. So it's a very rudimentary distribution. I'm going to talk about some changes that came out in 4.2.1, but that'll be in a different video. Okay. Anyways, so we've got this multi-tap configuration, and I'm going to show you how to configure this. So I'm going to say, okay, overlay traffic. Now, in my environment, I got my red is my VTAP. Okay, and that's what you see over here, this red dotted line. That means this port group, and this port group are set up for VLAN 12 in my example. Okay, so my TEPs can go through that port group. Now, how about my VLAN traffic? Remember, the edge is the boundary between your overlay and your VLAN? Well, same thing here. So I'm combining both those traffics on these two NICs. So in my example, I've got this blue blue over here would be my VLAN 100, and it's going out this NIC over here to the top of rack left. Okay. Then I've got my purple, which is VLAN 110, going out this NIC out to that top of rack right. So it's a way of me having deterministic, did I pronounce that right? Deterministic traffic, or traffic engineering seems to be the big buzzword. So I know, okay, for me to peer at top of rack left, I'm going through this interface. For me peering top of rack right, I'm going through this interface. And it goes back to that paragraph that I wrote, or I read in the design guide. So you're going to basically create name teamings to do that. Okay, and I'll explain that when I get into the demo. Okay, so this is what this video is all about. And you'll see, again, this port group here is using this physical NIC as its active NIC. And you see the black dotted line? It's saying it's going to use this NIC as a standby. If I clear that, this port group will use this physical NIC as its active NIC and this one as its standby. Okay? I'm not doing LACP or anything like that. It has nothing to do with any of that. And you'll see my management network here is using that as its active, and this is a standby. You'll see again, so if I look at this port group here, you'll see this in my demo. These two port groups that are being trunked, they're going to carry VLAN 12. That's my overlay VLAN in my lab environment. The one on the left is going to carry VLAN 100 for my top of rack left. And the one on the right is going to carry my VLAN 110, my top of rack right. Okay. I'm not showing you over here. Actually, I got management VLAN. Notice I've got between the two top of rack switches a link that's carrying the VTAP VLAN. So in case this NIC fails, we can still come through this path. Okay. So this is showing me a single VM on a single host. I could do that. Another thing is you could do two edge node VMs on a single host, which when you think about it, does that kind of make sense? Yes, no, you know what? I'll leave it up to you. If these are two 10 gig Ethernet NICs, I would probably say this is not a good idea. But if those are 40 gig NICs, 100 gig NICs, no problems. Those NICs can handle two edges, right? I would also want to have multiple hosts, maybe what I'm not showing in this picture, maybe there's a second ESXi host with another two edges. So I got 4 edges in total for redundancy in case this host fails, okay? I'm not showing that in this picture here, all right? But again, you can go back to here. I've got 4 hosts. I'm gonna run an edge node on each host. That's perfectly fine. Or maybe I got 4 hosts and I'm gonna run 2 edge nodes on each host. Again, that's perfectly fine, okay? You can do stuff like that. So again, you have options here. And what you see here, if you look at this picture, all this stuff is in the design guide as well. I redrew this. Again, same kind of concept. We're not using these other 2 NICs here, okay? What else do we got? Here they're showing me, again, this is on a host that has not been prepared for NSX. I will probably do a discussion on installing an edge node on a host that has been prepared for NSX. I'll probably do just a quick lecture type video on that one because there's a couple things you got to watch out for. I may have a presentation on that. Anyways, here they're showing me, here I got in my previous example, my host only has 2 NICs. Suppose if you have a physical host that has 4 NICs, well, again, you can configure this in a lot of different ways. When you look at the reference design guide, actually, that's not the slide I want. That's not the one I really wanted, is it? Yes, it is. When you look at the reference design guide, basically they're saying, oh, okay, I'll have these 2 NICs for that edge and, sorry, let me change up my colors here. I'll use these 2 NICs, the first 2 NICs, let's say for that edge, and I'll use the other 2 NICs for this edge. You can do something like that. Bottom line is you got flexibility. This stuff's not cast in concrete or cement where you have to do it like this. No, you have flexibility here. Okay. with that said, I think that's about it. Why don't we jump into how do we configure this name teaming? Okay? See you back in a bit. Oh, by the way, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, hey, click that subscribe button now. It would really do me a big favor, okay? And hit that like button too. That helps out with the YouTube analytics. See you back in a second. All right, everybody, let's get cracking here. Let's set this thing up. So I've logged in my NSX manager. I'm going to just go into System. In System, under Fabrics, excuse me, my first thing is I'm going to go to Profiles here. So these are my uplink profiles. There's a bunch of defaults here. You could actually utilize some of these for the edge. Like, for example, there's an NSX Edge multi VTEP uplink profile. You could potentially utilize this one and modify it if you want to. I'm just going to create my own because that's basically how I do things, right? So I'm just going to go in and create my uplink profile. So let me go in, I'll call it whatever, my edge profile, whatever, okay? Call it something that makes sense. Now, this interface might look slightly different depending on what you're using. I am on NSX 4.2.1, so this interface is a little bit different from the older versions, okay? It's asking me over here what my transport VLAN will be. My edge nodes, the taps in my environment's on VLAN 12. I just threw it on VLAN 12. And my, again, it's going to use the MTU that I'm going to use for my taps, for my edges, which match my host. It's 9,000 bytes. That's in my environment. I'm not doing any legs or anything like that. Now, when I go into teaming here, when I click on set, you'll see there's the default teaming profile. The default teaming profile is applicable to, well, it's the default teaming profile. What do you want? Do you want failover? So what's going to be the active uplink? What's going to be the standby? Do you want to do failback? This interface is slightly different if you got an older version of NSX. I can't remember when they updated. This might have been around the 4.1 days or something like that. I can't remember. But anyways, now I want to configure it. Well, by the way, here this says DPU backed uplinks. Those are data processing unit. SmartNICs, I don't have any, so I'm leaving that off. Okay, maybe I'll do a video on DPUs down the road. Because I want to have multi-taps, which is considered leading practices from VMware, recommended solution, I'm not going to do failover order. I'm just going to basically pick load balance based on source. Now, notice you got two choices here: load balance on source or load balance on source MAC. Load balance on source is the one VMware recommends. What that basically means is when I pick either one of these two, I will get basically multi-taps on my edges. So if I have 2 uplinks on my edge, I'm going to have a tap for each uplink. If I have 4 uplinks on my edge, I'll have 4 taps. That's a little overkill. VMware recommends 2. Again, load balancing, fault tolerance, performance, all that wonderful stuff. If you pick either one of these, whether it's load balance on source or source MAC, it will give you multi-taps. The load balance on source, basically, whatever the port, that's based on source port the VM's plugged into. So whatever the VM's plugged into, it will use a certain tap type of thing. Or the MAC address. If you're familiar with, I've talked about this in previous other videos. I'm just going to pick source, which is kind of the default here, all right? Now it's asking me, enter the active uplinks. Now you give these uplinks a name. You can call them pretty much what you want. I'm going to call mine uplink.u-1 for uplink 1, comma u-2 for uplink 2. They're both active, okay? If I typed in u-3, then again, I would get 3 taps. If I dashed u-4, you kind of get the idea. I'm just going to do 2 uplinks, okay? And I'm going to add. Great. There's my teaming profile. Now, by default, my taps and VLANs will use this default teaming policy here. Now, if I go to add teaming, this is where name teaming comes into play, or used to be called VLAN pinning. If I go add teaming, it's going to ask me for a name here. And I'm going to call this TOR, top of rack, right. Actually, I'll call it top of rack left. I'm left-handed, so top of rack left. And then I'm basically going to say fail over order. And I'm going to say my active uplink will be uplink-1, right? And I'm not going to put a standby, okay? I'm going to add that in. I'm going to do another one here, tor-right. And I'm going to say this active one will be uplink-2. Sort of like what I talked about in my little presentation there. So again, you'll see the default. Let me just apply this. And let's go back into here and see what it looks like. So you'll see the top there, my default teaming profile. My taps will use uplinks 1 and 2, which is great. And then my uplinks get to the outside world. We'll use the top of rack right. We'll use uplink 2, and then the other one left will use uplink 1. Sort of like what I talked about in my presentation. So great. There's my name policies here, Tor right and Tor left. Let me apply this. Let me save that. Great, I'm done. I just created my uplink profile. Again, I could have used this one here and edited it if I want to, but I figured I'd just go through the whole process. What's my next thing? I need to create a transport zone now. Generally speaking, I already have an overlay transport zone, but remember my edge needs to connect to overlay and VLAN transport zones because it's the boundary between physical and virtual. So let's create a new transport zone. We'll call it prod-VLAN-transport zone, and it's a VLAN back transport zone. Notice over here it's asking, you can enter VLAN numbers here. When I create VLAN back segments to connect to the outside world, which I'll show you later, okay? When I create those segments and I specify a VLAN there, they would have to be within this range, okay? This is optional. I don't have to fill this out. I'm going to leave it blank. Over here, which is the main thing of this video, is the uplink teaming policy names. So when I click on this, you get a drop down. You see some teaming policies here, teaming 1 and teaming 2. These are some default name policies or name teaming that came with NSX 4.2.1. There you'll see top of rack left and right. Okay, so I'm going to pick left and right. So I'm saying this. Any segments using this VLAN, VLAN back transport zone will be able to take advantage of these teaming policies, okay, or this name teaming policy. So I'm going to say save, and that's pretty much it. So now what I need to do is I actually need to now deploy my edge nodes, okay? So why don't we go ahead and do that? Okay, so I'm ready to deploy my edge nodes. Now, the edge virtual NICs need to connect to some port groups, right? Since it's a VM that I'm actually creating. Now, if I go into my environment, let me go in my vSphere environment. Let me just go to my hosts and clusters view. You'll see in my environment, I actually have 2 separate vSphere clusters. I have a compute cluster with hosts 1, 2, 3, right? And I got some VMs there. This compute cluster has been prepared for NSX, means that, these VMs could use overlay networks. Then I've got a separate cluster, a management edge cluster. Again, this is a separate vSphere cluster, and you can think of it as dedicated almost to edge nodes. I got my vCenter, or actually I have my NSX there, or my vCenter. It doesn't really matter. But this is where I'm going to install my edges. Notice again, I've got hosts 4, 5, and 6. Now you'll notice I don't have any NSX there or anything like that because this is a nested environment, and I don't want my NSX and my vCenters nested inside a VM in my lab environment because the performance would suck. All right. So anyways, it doesn't really matter. So you might run into an environment where again, you have a separate cluster just for edge nodes. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. So these hosts have not been prepared for NSX. They do not have TEPs on them or VTEPs on them. Let me go into my distributed switches here. Let me minimize this. You'll see I got a few distributed switches. The one that's important to us for this demo is this VDS management. That's actually the one that my management/edge cluster is going to use. When I open that up, you'll see I got some port groups there, for vSAN, for vMotion, whatever. But I also created these port groups called port group trunk 1, port group trunk 2. That's, again, going back to my little demo or my little presentation I did before this, right? So if I actually look at this, if I edit the settings in here, if I look at VLANs, you'll see it is a VLAN type trunking, and I'm allowing VLANs 12 and 100 to go through this port group, this trunk-1. This trunk 1 will go to my left top of rack switch. Trunk-2 will go to my right top of rack switch. Okay, so the VLAN 12 is my TAP, okay, VLAN, and my VLAN 100 again is my network to connect to my top of rack my left router, okay? So again, I've got both VLANs in there. And I'm going to say cancel that. Oh, sorry. Then when I look at my teaming policy, you'll see this one is using uplink 1 is active and uplink 2 is at standby, okay? And I'm using explicit failover order. Anyways, let me cancel that. Let's look at trunk 2. Trunk 2, it should be the opposite of this. You should say uplink 2 is the active, uplink 1 is a standby. Let me cancel this. Let's go to trunk 2. Let's edit settings. When we look at the teaming and failover, again, we see it's using the other uplink as its active and the other one as its standby. So again, going back to my presentation, all right? If I go to VLANs here, you'll see that this one's carrying, again, my VTEP VLAN, great, 12. Both of them are carrying that. But this one here is carrying VLAN 110. Again, that's my second leg to get to the outside world, the 110 network, the 192.168.110 network type of thing. So I'm going to cancel that. Again, going back to my diagram. So I've already got those port groups configured, right? And that's what I'm going to connect my edge to. So I wanted to show you that. So let's go and deploy my edge. Again, I've got some videos on this as well. But let's go into nodes. I'm just going to show you the first one, and then the second one I'll deploy kind of off camera. So this will be site A-NSX Edge-01, and it's fully qualified domain name. Site A-NSX Edge-01.vclass.local. Description. I'm going to deploy it medium, okay? And then over here, it's asking me for my password stuff for admin and all that wonderful stuff. I'll probably speed this up. Now over here, it's asking me my compute manager for vCenter. I've already have that set up. It's my vCenter server. What cluster is this going on? This is going to go on my management edge cluster. So I'm going to pick that one. I don't care about resource pool or host. Again, be specific. I'm going to put it on this data store. It's a vSAN data store. Great. I'm going to go next. Now it's asking me over. This is asking me, again, if you ever watch me deploy the edge videos, this is asking me what's the management interface. That's the first virtual NIC on that VM. What's the management interface connecting to, right? So first of all, what's its IP going to be? I'm going to say it's going to be static, only IP4. I'm going to type in its address, 172.20.10.61/24 is mine. It's gateway 172.20.10.10. This is my management network I'm typing in here. Now it's saying, what port group is this virtual NIC going to connect to? That's what this select interface is. And this is going to go onto a management network, all right? So management network. Again, this has to be, nope. Yeah, the management network, I'm going to go save. This has to, that port group has to be accessible to your NSX manager. In other words, that port group, if it's on a certain VLAN, has to be on the same VLAN that your NSX manager is, because they need to talk to each other. And then over here, it's domain, my search domain. I go vclass.local, my DNS server 172.20.10.10. This is all I got in my lab environment. And 1 second on this one, I got to pull this up. Okay, so let me put in my NTP server. Oops, I thought I copied that. I guess I didn't. Let's try that one more time. These are just some external NTP servers. And actually, one thing I noticed when I was just looking these up, at my management interface, I actually had it connected to the wrong port group. I should have connected it to this different one. So I picked the right one. So you got to make sure that that interface goes to your management port group that your NSX manager is on the same subnet or has accessibility to. All right, or else the deploy will fail. Again, I don't have any DPUs, so I'm going to say no here. I'm going to click next. Oops. Now at this point, it's going to ask me how many NSX virtual distributed switches I want to create on my edge nodes. If you've ever watched me do other videos, I've created 2 or more NSX virtual distributed switches on my edge. In this case, since we're just going to follow leading practices, VMware recommends a single NSX virtual distributed switch. Again, as I mentioned before, eases administration. So I'll just call this, I don't have much of an imagination, I'll call this NSX virtual distributed switch -01, whatever, right? Now, what transport zones is this going to be part of? This, since I only got one switch, this edge needs to be part of both my overlay network and my VLAN back networks. Again, it connects physical to virtual. So I'm going to put this transport zone and that transport zone. That's what I have created in my environment. Oops, didn't want to do that. What uplink profile? Let me pick that, my edge profile that I created. IP addresses for the taps. Again, it's going to be IP4, IP6, again, and how do I assign that? I'm just going to go IP4 in my environment. I could use an IP pool, an NSX IP pool, or I'm going to do a static list. I'm going to do a static list on mine, so I'm just going to type in the IP address of my taps, 172.20.11.181. I'll hit enter, 172.20.11.191. Did I make a mistake there? 2.20.11.181. There, I thought I typed in that. Maybe I canceled it by accident. What's the default gateway? 172.20.11. Oh, that's wrong. I just realized that. 172.20.12.181. 172.20.12.191. It's on the 12 VLAN. And this is going to be 172.20.12.10 is my default gateway. And the mask, 255.225.225.0. Great. Now notice over here, you see the two uplinks, U1 and U2. That's all I specified in that uplink profile. If I had U1, 2, 3, and 4, I'd see a list of 4 of them here. I only got the 2, so I'm going to pick U1. We'll go to what port group? Again, it's going to go to that trunk 1 port group going to my top of rack left. Probably I should have called it TOR left or something like that. I'll go save. And then the other interface will go to the other port group, trunk port group 2. That's going to my top of rack right. And I'll go save. Again, just back to my diagrams here. That's it. I'm going to hit finish. And it's going to deploy it. Okay? Now, I'm not done yet. Okay? There's still a couple more things got to do. I'm going to pause this. I'm going to deploy a second one. We'll create my edge cluster. Then we'll go in and start getting ready for my tier 0 gateway, which is easy. But then the main thing is we'll look at the segments. Okay? So I'll be right back. Okay, so we are back, and I've deployed my second edge node, edge 02 over here, right? So let's just close that. So what are we going to do here? Just real quick, we're going to create an edge cluster, add edge cluster. So I'll just say edge cluster, whatever. Probably made a typo in the spelling there. Let's select those 2 edges. Okay, I'm done. I added it. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do, and this is pretty much almost the last thing, if we go back into networking here, I can create my gateway, my tier 0 gateway now at this point. However, I still need 2 segments, 2 VLAN back segments going out to the real world, right? So I still got to create those. So if I click on this, I only got my web app and database segment from before. So I'm going to click on add segment, and this is again part of the name teaming now. This is a special part. I'll call this, I don't know, up link 1, whatever. I'm going to say it is on the VLAN transport zone. Where is it? VLAN transport zone. And then over here, what VLAN is this? This is going to be my VLAN 100 in my example. And then uplink teaming policy. When I select this, this is now where I get to pick, like, okay, yes, I want this one now to use the top of rack left, okay? So then I'll save that. And again, I got this from my uplink profile that I created. And when I attached it to that transport zone, that's how it knew, oh, these are named policies that are able to be enabled on this segment. So there we go, great. I'll save this. And now I don't want to make any more changes. I'll add another segment. We'll call this uplink, uplink -2, whatever. Again, it's going to be part of that VLAN transport zone I created. And again, this is going to be a VLAN 110. And at that point here, here we go, the teaming policy. I'm going to pick top of rack right. Okay, so I'm just going to go save, and I'm going to say no. Now at this point, there's really nothing different from, within NSX. I deploy my tier 0 gateway, I attach it to these segments, set up my routing protocols, and I'm pretty much done at that point. So, and then I just test for connectivity. So I'll probably speed this up. Okay, so let's go in. I'm not going to speed this up. Let's go in and create a tier 0 gateway. Call it tier 0-gateway-01. It's active. I'll pick my edge cluster. And at that point, I can't configure any interfaces. I got to save it. I'm going to say, yes, I want to continue. And then at that point, I'm going to go into interfaces here and create my interfaces. So remember, I got 2 edges here, okay? If I had more, I have to have more interfaces. So let's add an interface. I'll call this interface-1. And it's going to be 192.168.100.2/24. And then my segment, I'm going to put that on uplink 1. And then it's going to go to edge 1. Great, I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to add another interface, interface-2. This is going to be on the other subnet, the top of rack right, 192.168.110.2/24. And then this is going to be on the uplink 2 segment, and that should be on edge 1 as well. Now I'm going to repeat the process. So now my edge 1 has 2 interfaces. One going to top of rack left, another one going top of rack right. Okay, and top of rack left is the 192.168 subnet. Top of rack right is 192.168.110 subnet. I need to repeat this for edge 2. If I had, now I only got 2 edges, right? So I'm giving each 2 interfaces. If I had 4 edges here, I would have to repeat this 6 more times, okay? So I'm only going to do this one more time. So let's add interface, call it interface-3. I probably should say edge node, whatever. But anyways, and then I'll say 192.168.100.3/24. This is uplink 1, top rack left, edge node 2. Save it. Then add interface, interface-4. This is 192.168.110.3 slash, I probably should write this down, 24, and then that's uplink 2, top rack right, and then that's edge 2. So I just saved, so I've created 2 interfaces for edge. Here's, where do we see it here? Edge 1 has 2 interfaces, interface 1, interface 2, okay? My other edge node has that as well, okay? So like I said, if I only got 2 edge nodes in this cluster. If I had 4, I'd have to have 2 interfaces per edge in the way I've got this set up, sort of like how I described it, all right? Now at that point here, again, these are my segments here. Uplink 1 and uplink 2 are the segments that's used in those named teaming profiles, right? So at this point here, it's just me setting up my routing, connecting my tier 1, and just testing connectivity, which is basically just like anything else. So at this point, I'm going to speed this up because this is nothing new, and I've got this covered and detailed in my routing videos. So let me close this, and then we'll continue on. Okay, that's it, everybody. I did put that in fast forward. Just, again, I have other videos covering how to set all that stuff up. The main thing here is to talk about the named teaming policies, right? So I got my tier 1 gateway deployed. It's connected to my tier 0. If I click on that, you see it's successful. Everything is good. It's using that edge cluster that I've got. If I connect on my command prompt here, I'm going to ping one of my web servers in my virtual environment. So there we go. I got north-south connectivity going through my edge nodes. Again, I'm using that name teaming policies. So that's pretty much it. I hope you found the video useful. Again, please support the channel by subscribing to it. Hit the thumbs up, sharing, you know, all that kind of stuff. Liking the video, all that stuff helps out. Leave your comments and questions down below. If there's anything you want to see me do or cover, please leave that down below. I'll do my best. There's been changes in the VMUG program and obviously Broadcom as well. So it's difficult to get access to software now. They got a new program that's coming out, but again, maybe that's a topic for another video. But leave your comments and questions down below. Thanks again. Have a great day, everybody. See you in the next one. Bye now.